Okay. All right. So are we just going to wait a couple more minutes, you think, Dustin? Or is this
We can. So, I mean, we only need three folks here to establish quorum. So, I do believe we have that in attendance. We got the whole committee here right now, so we
okay?
can get going. But if we want to wait for some more stakeholders to join up, that way we can maybe do some introductions and kind of just intro what we have going on.
Okay. We can wait another minute or so, I think.
Okay. I
I
don't think
see.
we'll need the whole 2 hours, but
No, I hope not.
it's available if we want to.
No, but I do know we want some of those stakeholders involved. So,
Well, I think I see Spencer, John, and Darren all join in here. So,
okay.
Yeah.
All right. There we go. I guess we could get started then. So let's get my screen where I want it. Well, welcome to the special committee, I guess is what we're calling. Is this? Yeah, special
Well,
committee on side yard setbacks.
that's the name I gave it, and I don't know if
Okay.
there's a more appropriate one, but I think it'll
I,
work.
I like it. So, all right. So, welcome everybody. Thank you for taking time on Friday afternoon. Let's go ahead and take roll there, Dustin.
Dan Young,
Present.
Todd Byrather,
here.
Tom Young,
Here.
Chell Anderson,
I'm here.
Jay Arnold is not here, so I misspoke, but we do have a quorum of the group and ready to go.
All right. And then if other people would like to introduce themselves, go ahead and raise your hands. Patrick.
Yes, thank you. Long time no see for some of you folks that were on the last call. Patrick Hanks with the Building Industry Association of Washington.
Thank you, Patrick. And then I have John Goldsmith.
Jonathan Goldsmith, City of Spokane, Deputy Building Official, and WAVO.
All right, thank you. And Spencer.
Spencer, I don't see you as unmuted yet. Still no unmute.
Okay, while he's doing that, go ahead, Darren.
Darren Homechick, City of Bothell Building Division Plans Examiner.
Thank you. Welcome, everybody. Let's see. Did Spencer come back on?
I mean, I see him here. He's got his hand down and he's not unmuted.
I'll take the liberty. If you don't know Spencer, Spencer is the planning director at City of Spokane.
Yep. So, all right. So we're done with that until Spencer can pop on. Let's go next to review and approve agenda, which is up on the screen. So do I have a motion? Okay, so thank you, Joe. Do I have a second?
Second, Todd.
All right. Any changes for anybody? Any discussion?
Yes, discussion. On this one, when I was getting all these scheduled for today, I made a mistake and didn't change the number 3 topic on the one that went out with the Gov delivery. If you notice the website, there's an updated agenda on there that has number 3 as side yard setbacks, but the one that was sent out with Gov delivery said implementation date discussion. So I would just maybe entertain a motion to approve as changed here.
So moved.
Second.
All right, there we go.
We do
All right.
not want to talk about implementation date here.
I guess not.
Only 2 more hours.
All right, so let's go ahead and have a voice vote. All in favor?
Yes.
Aye.
Aye.
All right. Any opposed? All right. Well, we will get into number 3 then, the side yard setbacks discussion. So I think we're all aware that this was brought forth quite a while back. We took a vote for an emergency rule, did not pass, but a lot of us thought it was still an important topic, and that's why we're here today. Dustin, can you pull up the what was the
You want to see the proposal or
the proposal, just so we have it in front of us.
So this was the proposal to add a new section underneath 504.1.1 And if it helps, I can get this ready to show all in line with 504.1. I think that section is relevant to the discussion because this section is only applicable to commercial buildings in my interpretation of it. And I believe it's been characterized by Ken Brulette during some of the conversation for the emergency rule.
Okay. Yeah, if you want to bring that up.
Yeah, we'll get it open right now.
Dan, this is Spencer. Do you want me to introduce myself now?
Sure, go ahead.
Sorry, I got a new phone recently, and I can't tell you how much I hate Apple products. It's sort of an irrational thing for me. Anyway, I'm Spencer Gardner. I'm the planning director for the city of Spokane. I heard Todd introduce me sort of already, but thanks for having me.
Yeah, no problem. And good luck with the phone.
All right, so bringing up the 504.1, this is, if you notice, the 2021 Washington State Fire Code. So in section 504, we don't currently contain any state amendment. And so that code language proposal that's on there would be adding 504.1.1. And the point I was trying to highlight is this first sentence in here is exterior doors and openings required by this code or the International Building Code shall be maintained readily accessible for emergency access by the fire department. And so I think Ken was characterizing that this would mean that anything we put under 504.1.1 wouldn't necessarily apply to residential construction, which I believe is kind of counter to the intent of the emergency rulemaking request, which is specifically talking about residential side yard access.
Correct. So, well, it would affect anything that was built out of the IBC, but it wouldn't affect anything that was built out of the IRC then.
That was
And-
I think
yeah.
the point that was trying to be made,
Yeah.
and I thought it was relevant for the discussion to,
Yeah.
maybe it could be targeted somewhere else or add, a modification to this section as well.
Yeah. Okay. Todd, you have your hand up.
Yeah, on that point, I think that's important because I think that was one of the intents, to my understanding, that it was in the building code, partially to deal with the hierarchy of the codes. But I just also wanted to maybe take 5 seconds, if I may, to say, if anyone's on the call and not tracking, or maybe just for the record, this was submitted as an emergency petition. And in order for an emergency petition to be considered for its merits, the council has to first establish whether or not there's an emergency basis exists. It did not. And I think, as Dan, you pointed out, then the second part of that motion was to bring it down to the BRFW.
BFRW.
I don't know why I forgot that at this time on Friday, but committee to explore more. And then from that was a recommendation back up to the council to form the special committee. And here we are today. So this is really exploratory, and it's not a vehicle we often take as a council for kind of research on a topic, but that's what we're doing. And that's kind of the intent today.
Yeah. Yeah. So, Tom, your hand's up.
Okay, so and we have a lot of city and county officials, and they may be kind of aware of some of this, but so I wear a lot of hats. So I am a co-owner of Azure Northwest Homes. We're a home builder. Okay, we're also land developer, so we deal with a lot of residential and development codes. And so I think this matter came up as a result of a bill passed by the state legislature to address missing middle housing. So the state had passed a lot of new legislation to address housing affordability. So 10 years ago, in the last comp plan update, the state office of financial management allocates growth to different jurisdictions, and one ways for them to take on the growth is to rezone and things like that. And so 10 or 15 years ago, when the state let the cities and counties under their own recognizance and their own, doing the responsible thing to absorb the growth. One of the simplest things was to, change the zoning and upzone. Well, the cities and counties did nothing. And so this time, 10 years later, the state enacted a lot of legislation to force the cities to increase housing in their area. And one of the bills is this middle housing, which allows like 6 units per lot. And so all of a sudden, instead of one lot having one house that you have to deal with, the side yard setbacks for one structure, and there's really no separation for one house, maybe your garage, if you have a detached garage, all of a sudden this new issue came up that they could have multiple structures on one lot. And the matter is not necessarily so much the side yard from the property line, it's maybe the spacing in between these structures. And so I think this is what has come up from some of that new state mandated legislation imposed upon the cities and counties. And so this housing affordability is of a high priority in the state with just the number of laws that they put in place. So I just kind of put that out. So whatever we're doing, we want to kind of understand the context of it in relation to some of the other goals that the state legislature has. So they have a very strong desire to create more housing, to make housing more affordable. And so whatever we do, we want to be cognizant of that, so we don't unwittingly start dismantling, some of their goals. So
Yeah. Thank you, Tom. Yeah, all of that is true and stuff. And sometimes when we get going, then a law of unintended consequences, and this was brought forth by the fire service where they were having issues. So sometimes the law of unintended consequences, and we just tried to make changes to make it better. So I think that's what we need to have the discussion for here. Jel, you have your hand up.
Yeah, my initial thoughts on this, and I don't know if, I guess we're in discussion right now. There's parts of residential code like R310 talks about emergency egress windows, and those have an egress path of 3 feet to a public way, which is an alley or a road or something like that. And so I was unclear to me why 5 feet is necessary if 3 feet is both the interior stair width that's required for egress inside residential units, as well as the exterior egress required from residential units. So I was questioning first the 5 feet in the proposed rule versus 3 feet that's currently the rules as far as egress goes from residential on a lot like this. It's R310.1.
Would it help if I make that bigger for everybody?
And I guess the context of why I brought it up is for the same reasons that Tom was speaking, is if we're increasing affordability, that means we want a lot of units for less money. And so every time you take away the ability to build something by requiring an egress to be wider, you are decreasing the affordability. So, there should be a significant justification if we need 5 feet instead of 3 feet.
There we go. Yeah, I think with that, when the State Fire Marshals Association brought this forward, they were discussing all that, because when you have 3 feet, and so we're looking at safety for firefighters, because when you set up a ladder in 3 feet in a steep angle, if you're trying to rescue somebody from that, you're putting people at danger. The other aspect was, um, and it came about because some of the houses had a side entrance to that 3 feet, and getting a gurney out in 3 feet, making the current corner and also performing um, life-saving operations, made it very difficult. So that's what brought it all up. So anyway, Darren.
I think this is a little apples and oranges because emergency escape and rescue opening it's basically typically from a sleeping room. It's a window. Um, and 5041 says exterior doors and opening. So it really to me is inferring that this is the front door where the fire department's going to bring a stretcher to the front door and they need to maybe make a 90-degree turn, and they can't do that in 3 feet. So I think that it's a little bit not a direct comparison. And it says we're required by the fire code officials. So they could make that determination locally, I would think, under that. But I think that's it. It's really not the same thing. It's really the front door is really what it looks to me like.
Well, under 504, it says exterior doors and openings required by this code. So an emergency escape window is an opening. And that's why, obviously that's why we're doing this, is because I think there was some concern with the way it was written before, um, and trying to get some consensus on a good way of putting this in if it goes in. And that's what all this discussion's about. So the way I read it, and let me know if I'm wrong, but it says exterior doors and openings required by this code, um, are the International Building Code. But so a rescue opening is an opening in those walls, and that's what I think where a lot of the discussion came about. So the other thing is I know in the residential code, if you have a 3 foot side yard, then those windows, don't those have to be protected? It's been a long time since I've done that, because anything less than 5 feet. So are a lot of these houses or apart or whatever being built with the windows on the side? Jill?
Yeah, I think so. Even if a setback is 5 feet from a side yard, let's say the fence is built on your side of the property because you and your neighbor have agreed to just put it on your property. Now the 5 foot setback is a 5 foot setback from the property line, but if the fence is 6 inches wide, let's say, now you have a 4'6" clear width for a 5 foot side yard. One of the bills that didn't pass last year would have even lowered that further for buildings that added extra insulation to them, would have reduced the zoning setback from 5 feet to 4'8" or something like that, just to accommodate more insulation to meet kind of different state energy goals. That did not pass, but it had a bunch of support in it. And so I think a 5 foot clear width is not at all similar to a setback, because there can be lots of stuff that goes in the setback that is allowed by the code.
Jared, do you see Spencer's hand? Just by
Oh, I do now. There we go. Spencer.
Hi, thanks. I guess I have sort of a question and an observation. The question is, these building types were already allowed previously prior to the middle housing legislation. So I'm trying to understand what prompts the concerns. Does it boil down to, well, now we're allowing this in more situations, and so it's an issue of, as these buildings increase in number, there's a concern? Or why would these concerns not have been brought up previously? Because these building types could have been built. That's my question. And then my observation is, I believe that at least on the part of one of the fire officials who was formerly associated with the city of Spokane, the interest in this type of change really arose from learning that the city of Tacoma may have some kind of similar requirement. So it may be worth finding out how Tacoma handles this, because my understanding is they do have some kind of requirements similar to what's being proposed, but they're much narrower and maybe a better template for us to look at. That's all.
Yeah. So the first part, the question about, I think as we get more and more of these in, then, obviously the frequency of the issues have arisen, if that's the right way of saying it. And I think that's what brought it to the forefront. And I know that when Dave Colcott brought this up, he discussed Vancouver's, which was similar to what he had. I had not seen anything on Tacoma's at all. So that's first I've heard of that. So I think that would be a good thing to look up.
I may have misspoken. It may have been Vancouver.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So Vancouver's, I think, was very similar to this. Dustin, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I was just as we're talking about this, I can't help but think that it seems like we're talking about the side yard clearance at the primary residence on a lot. And we're talking about turn radiuses for gurneys and things coming out. When this was first brought to me, I felt like it was characterized as needing access to ADUs and things that might be in the back that could be impeded by things that might be placed in those. And then it kind of has moved towards, we're talking about how close a building can get by the fire separation distances here in the table in chapter 3 for the residential code. But I thought the characterization was the need, as we have more and more residences going onto the lots, that the access around maybe the primary structure could become impeded, and that's where the emergency services aren't able to get there. And I didn't necessarily see it as I think the ladder set up on a second story is a relevant, discussion topic about what's the safe ladder angles and things like that. But I thought more the issue was, if there's emergency access needed at the rear of the building and there's just a smaller width pathway that maybe, is less than 36 inches because something's been put there, that was the main issue. At least that's how I kind of characterized it at the beginning. And it seems like we're more talking now. We talk about whether or not it's a primary street facing entrance was one of the last discussion topics. And I thought that, I don't know if we're getting away from the original intent of what they're trying to solve.
Yeah, I think it's all of it, I think. So anyway, let's see. Tom, you had your hand up.
You're muted, Tom.
Okay, so I think how this all kind of came about, or are these new laws implemented by the state to address affordable housing is so drastically different from anything in the past. And so, whereas in the past, the like zoning codes and building codes, you have one structure on one lot. It's going to tell you what your side yard setback will be, your front yard setback, and your rear yard setback is going to be. And so the state, in response to just wanting to create more housing, and the cities and other like counties really didn't do things to change their codes, and it's primarily their development code. They just said, look, middle housing from here on, every lot will be allowed to have 2 ADUs or 6 units per lot. That's what it's going to be. Okay, they didn't go into any detail about, okay, so now you got several structures on one lot. Previously, you only had one structure on one lot with your side yard, front and back setbacks and separations. And now that you got, you will allow 6 units per lot. And then so what has been happening is, okay, builders come in, we're allowed 6 units. We're going to squeeze in 6 units per lot. Now, sometimes it's not that practical because the lot's too small, but that's another matter. And then, so we currently don't have the codes to say, okay, now you got 6 units. on one lot, and there's got to be some kind of separation. And that's not in the kind of current codes right now. And so I think that's coming up as an issue, whether it's the front entry or the side entry or whatever. I think the fire department is kind of responding, oh no, they're really squeezing some of these in, and there's really no guiding codes for that right now. So, so it's like, and the fire department could say, give us more if we can get more, and so now, this may be a bit more complicated and kind of detailed task, and then they may have to, each city may have to come up with their own development code to say, now previously one structure per lot, now the state mandates that we allow 6 structures per lot. So how do we accommodate the separation and the concerns of the fire department?
Okay. Darren, I think you were next.
So I guess the change is making a 5 foot by 5 foot access, because the second sentence is 504.1. It says an improved access walkway leading from fire apparatus access roads to exterior openings. You don't have a walkway going to a window. You have walkways going to doors, right? So that section should be changed to exterior doors if that's what they want. If they want to have a 5 foot access for gurneys to get to doors, they should write it so it's just exterior doors and not have openings to get that area for the gurney, and that way you pick up the access walkway leading to exterior openings. I don't know if that makes sense, but I think that's their intent. It's not to windows, it's to doors. That's the intent.
Okay. Yeah. Joe?
Sorry, I didn't. My hand wasn't intended to be up.
Okay. So yeah, Darren, I think that's a good point too, because when I read it again, as we all have a tendency to reread things and start looking at it, for access to building entrances is where it was. I think the other just kind of has morphed into it because I just remember those the pictures that Dave Colcott had provided that showed ladders and stuff, and I think we've kind of got off track a little bit on that. So if we're just looking at this, when the way they've put it, for jurisdictions that do not specify a minimum width, a minimum of 5 feet clear width is required for access to building entrances that do not face the street, alley, or parking lot. I guess that would be a concern, is you could change that to building. Well, I guess when you read it right, building entrances, it's kind of a door. Thank you, Dustin. Appreciate you making it a little bigger for.
It's more for my benefit. Trust me. I just don't
Oh,
want to put on glasses.
Oh, I have a big screen, but sometimes even, yeah, my glasses are for distance. So, but yeah. Okay, and then I see that John Goldsmith, you had your hand up.
Chair, you might be missing folks' hands up at the top of the screen. We got Spencer and Jay with their hands up as
Oh,
well.
okay. Yeah.
You want me to wait in line or go?
I mean, I'll let the chair call for you. I just want to make sure that those are noticed because I
Yeah.
think Spencer was up before.
Okay. I'm not sure how it works on mine. I'm just going with the ones that's on the top of mine. It's not putting
Okay.
them, I don't think, in order. All right, go ahead, John, and then we'll get to Jay and then Patrick.
One of the things I have concerns about on this, when we start accessing ADUs or second structures in the back with the 5 foot access path, is it'll open up what kind of walking surface do we have? Is it an all-weather walking surface? Is it grass? Can it go over landscaping? What can the slope be? What can the elevations be? and all of a sudden we're getting too steep. Is it, you know, a ramp that has to be put in? Then once we get this in, are we sloped too much to where we're going to start taking a lot of these properties and not allow them to put multiple units on them because we don't have the sloping or the access to meet the minimum requirements of what the definition of the path is going to be? So just something I've been thinking about and throwing out there for thought.
Thank you. And then I think what you said, Jay was next.
I
Dustin,
got
on that.
Spencer at the top of my
Right.
list, and then Jay.
Okay,
But
then
Jay, I think is
right.
just letting us know he's here.
I think my hand is the zombie version of me that was on before I
Oh.
could fix my mic issues. So you can
I'll
disregard that.
lower it, and hopefully I won't be. There we go. So Jay's next.
Okay, Jay.
Thank you, Dan. I just wanted to respond to Tom's comments, and I recognize that for many jurisdictions, they're grappling with the newness of this. However, in my jurisdiction and many others, we did a lot of the middle housing requirements in our zoning code before required by the state, and so I've been dealing with this. And one of the things that we looked at this in Kirkland when we did this is saying, okay, what you could do with the property and the access and the requirements for middle housing would be the same as what you could do with other building types. So it was a larger house or whatever. And so with the lot coverage and other requirements, there may not be every single lot being able to get to 6 units, but just not being too restrictive. So one of the things I like about what's on the screen here is it sets a standard, but it only does that it does it for the sets a standard for jurisdictions that don't have it already.
So, Jay, right in the end of that, you broke up just a little bit.
Okay, I said one of the things I liked about what was on the screen is it talks about setting a standard for jurisdictions that don't have it already. And so I'm just acknowledging that I think that's important to acknowledge it for jurisdictions that have already dealt with this and whose fire officials may be comfortable with the lower.
Okay, thank you. And then I think, Dustin, you said Patrick was next?
Yes, sir.
All right, Patrick.
Yes, thank you. So there's a bunch of problems with the proposed code language. I've brought up, many issues in past meetings. I'm not going to go up all of those again. Some of those have been brought up again today by others. And then I think John Goldsmith brought up some very good points that I haven't heard made before that should be addressed. But I think ultimately the big thing for the committee right now is there's confusion about what problem you're trying to solve and why a statewide code change is needed to address that problem. And then once you get those two questions answered, and if you decide that a statewide code change is necessary, you then have the process of how to write code language for that. But I'm getting very frustrated as a stakeholder of you guys having tons and tons of meetings with discussion that just drags out and out and out. This particular item has taken up like 4 months now. And so it'd be really nice if you could just figure out what you're doing, why you're doing it quickly, and then create a clear plan of what's going to happen and when you're going to do it, so that it's not, I don't want to sit through weeks and weeks and weeks more of multiple 2-3 hour meetings to just keep talking about this issue with and everybody bringing up the same major concerns, it never getting addressed, and people still trying to push this without clearly addressing a problem and why state code, why change is needed, and then having a discussion about the specifics of the code language. So thank you.
Thank you, Patrick. And then is John, your hand up again, or was that from earlier? Oh, okay.
That was from earlier. Apologies.
Oh, no problem. We all have issues with this at times. So, okay. Jill.
Yeah, I think Patrick is right. I think we need to define what problem we're solving or problem could be addressed by this. And I've heard a few different ones. One is getting a gurney into each of the 4 or 6 units on a site. I haven't heard anybody talk about egress or access from windows, but I have heard about letter setup. And those are the 2 primary issues I've heard brought up, but I haven't heard from the proponents the specific, to Patrick's point, the specific problem we're trying to solve. And then I think we could solve it once we have that specific issue.
Okay. Well, I know that I'm part of the State Fire Marshals Association, and they're the ones that brought it forth, but the biggest proponent was Dave. Be nice to have him here, maybe get a little bit of clarity, or we can get clarity before, if we have another meeting. But thinking back on it, I think it all started with the gurneys, and the way this is written, it is addressing more of that. And then I think the others were just brought up along as we discussed other things too. So I think the main concern is the gurneys out of the entrances. And then Spencer, your hand was up.
I think that's still zombie me.
I put
Okay.
it down, I promise. Okay, it's
Yeah.
down.
Yeah, it was down, so that's why I brought it back up, because I saw it back up.
Yeah, I'm
I don't
sorry.
know.
I'm not sure what's going on. If
undead hand.
I don't know, Dustin, if you want to try kicking that version of me out of the meeting, but if
raise your hand for that platform, and I'll go ahead and kick that other one.
Hey,
Okay.
Dan, this is Ken Brulette, City, Seattle. I've had my hand up for like 25 minutes. I don't know if you guys just don't see it. I'm on
I
a
don't
cell phone.
I don't
I don't
see
even see you.
Yeah,
It's a phone call, 206 number.
that is not on my participants at all. And the look that Dustin's giving, I think he's the same way.
Jesus. All right.
I'm very sorry, Ken. So
No,
yeah,
it's
go
fine.
ahead.
If I can throw in my 2 cents. All right. So I've done a lot of, just the code development part of this. And here's the point. And let's get back to Patrick. Everybody's bringing up great points, but the main one is the gurney. If you look at means of egress in the residential code, just the means of egress, not talking about the rescue windows, just the means of egress. It talks about that door opening up into a public way. Normally in our single family dwellings, stuff built out of the residential code, you're facing a public way and you're able to get that gurney out. You're able to have that 5-foot clear space that you need for patient care to get that gurney out. What we're finding is with the ADUs, when they take their means of egress door and they face it towards the side, if you don't have that 5-foot clear for patient safety, you can't get that gurney out with a firefighter on each end of that gurney. What you have to do is you end up having to carry the patient out and put them on a gurney, and it's not good for patient care when you started the care inside the unit. So it's all about the front door, the means of egress. We need to modify the residential code to put in that requirement. So when the means of egress door does not face a public way, then it needs to have a clear width of 5 feet. The yard, yes, the yard can be 3 foot wide. Not going to talk about, laddering and all that, because this is pretty much the ADUs. In the city of Seattle, I'm fortunate enough to get a 5-foot setback for our ADUs, and we haven't run into this, but yeah, it's impossible. And it's all about patient care and getting in and out. So I'm hoping we can focus on that and not focus on, a slope issue, a ramp issue. If there's anything blocking it like trash cans, firefighters, there's plenty of us that can just get the stuff out of the way and get the patient out of the building. But when you get inside, if you can tilt the gurney up, and just like moving furniture and like a couch, you're gonna have to stand it up and move it in. We can get the gurney in that way, but once the patient is on it, you can't get the gurney out if there's only 3 feet there. It just physically is not possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Ken. And sorry about that. It now shows you as Ken Burlett. I don't know what happened, Ken. Sorry. Okay, and then Jell, you were next.
Yeah, and I was gonna ask what the Seattle code has in it specifically as far as language, because Ken, you brought up that it has language that requires 5 foot something or other.
Yeah, it's in our municipal code, and that's if you go into our tip sheets from SDCI, you'll see the 5 foot setback requirement. So we haven't seemed to have that problem. So we're fortunate right now. And you brought up a great point about the fences. Is yeah, you could still lose 6 inches or more, and yes, you could probably try to tweak with 4 feet, but 5 foot. Because what's going to happen is you're going to have to then change your position when you're on the gurney from being at the end to now having firefighters on the side. So it's a little bit more labor intensive to do it. So it's not like it can't be done, but you really want that 5 feet. That's what you need to get out of that means of egress. And that's what's we're looking at, the means of egress is for getting people out of the building. Plus also that those firefighters inside the building.
Yep. So you're saying it's in the municipal code, but not in the fire code? Or the
You are correct. Yeah, we haven't had the reasoning to have to try to come up with something specific in the fire code, but I would love to have it in the residential code in the means of egress section. So then it's caught not at the land use, it's caught, because it's missed the land use. Have it in the residential code that the requirement, if the front door, whatever you want to call it, the main entrance, it's not facing the public way, then it's still that 5 foot setback.
Yeah. Okay. I'll look that up. I'll see what that says. I guess 2 additional minor comments. I think 3 feet is fine from the front door to a public way. Seems reasonable to me. That's what we do at Windows. And then 5 feet, I wouldn't want to use the word clear width because that has specific accessibility things. And that means you probably have like a flat area with no porch, with no railings on it. I think we could probably have better language for a 5 foot turning radius but it does not have to be over like a flat. Clear width just has a very specific accessibility thing that I think would unduly constrain what you're trying to do with turning a gurney. So those are my 2 comments on it, but I'm going to look up the municipal code.
Thank you. And then Todd?
Yeah, thank you. This is helpful. I mean, I think I'll defend that we need to be here because I don't understand the problem yet, and I'm learning more today. So Ken, that was really helpful. I hadn't heard yet that essentially turning radius was the challenge. So if that's true, is there a better way to address this than instead of saying a flat 5 foot wide width for the for the setback or for the pathway? I'm sure I'm not using the correct terminology there, but to me, that's a different design problem than having a full setback all the way for 5 feet. And then just as a side, when I say, I think we need to identify what the problem is, that's what we're doing here. I think we also want to, we just do the public process. We could have done over a bunch of phone calls, I'm sure, but that's not how we conduct business. But the second one is to make sure, since this in the original problem statement was said that this is as a result of state law. I don't know that I agree with that statement, and I just want to head that off, that we have explored it in rulemaking before something like this gets dropped to legislature to fix a problem that may or may not be there. So thanks.
Thanks, Todd. And then I do see Spencer up again, so I don't know if that's.
I think this is the real Spencer Gardner.
This is the real me.
Okay. All right.
Thank
you, Spencer.
I had a question. I mean, I understand the concern about turn radius for gurney, and I think that's really helpful information. I agree with Todd. This is good discussion to have. I'm curious if maybe I'm also agreeing with Patrick here that it does feel like there's sort of not competing, but lack of clarity around what problem we're trying to solve. There's also language in there that talks about a sprinklered building only needing 4 feet. But if it's about gurney access and purely about gurney access, then why are sprinklers also included as a consideration? Maybe there's something I'm missing about it because I'm not exactly an expert here, but that was one thing that jumped out to me.
Well, I know that, in the case of a fire, sprinklers give us more time. But if it's a medical, I agree with you, Spencer. I don't know how that would affect a heart attack, right? But in a fire, it gives more time because for people to get out and that kind of stuff. So less chance. But if we're talking, medical emergency, I think the 5 would still need to be there. It's my opinion too on that. So, yeah, but I think this is good because I think we have gotten down to the root of the problem, and like Ken, you did very well on that, um, explaining it, and I think that's the issue we just need to focus on is the building entrances that do not face the street or alley. So those would be the ones off to the side. Patrick.
Yes, thank you. I'm trying to understand because am I correct that under the current IRC, you could have a bedroom on the second story, door is 3 feet wide, maybe less than 3 feet, and then it could go into a 3-foot wide hallway at a 90-degree angle in which you couldn't get a gurney through, and then it could connect to a 3-foot wide stairway. So that's another point. So you would just have to, yeah, I'm trying to understand why it's okay for inside the building. We're not requiring 5 feet for everything, but then once we get outside the building, we want to require 5 feet.
Yeah, Ken, I have a feeling you want to answer that one.
Hey, my hand is shown this time.
Yes.
So this is my suggestion to Patrick. Patrick, come up here, do a ride along with us in the city of Seattle, and ride with our medic units. See what they have to deal with patients going into buildings and how to get them out of buildings, tight spaces, and what they have to do. And I think more people would appreciate how difficult the job is. And understand that, yeah, we just need a couple more feet to be able to safely move somebody and provide that patient care that's necessary. I totally understand. I'm in a bedroom and now the medics come in there and they're going to put me on a backboard and they're going to carry me to a certain point to where they can get me to the gurney. That's all, that's reality. Is they're not going to necessarily get that gurney all the way into my bedroom. They're going to have it staged outside and they're going to move me in a different method in which they're going to be tilting me and twisting me if necessary to get there. So I really think people really need to do ride-alongs and really understand what reality is out there.
Thanks, Ken. Todd?
I'll take you up on that, Ken. I'd love to learn about that. But are we zeroing in on the challenges that radius, or I'm curious, Ken, is there still something about the width over the whole lot line and building that it is necessary? If there was a provision at the entrance to address that turning radius, is that sufficient without having to add the 5 feet across the entire setback?
And I would, I think that's something that you look at negotiating to see if you can come up with some language. I just think it's difficult to just say, well, you only need to provide, that 5 foot or that turning radius in front of the door, and how you build that structure to do that. So now you're going to take all of these pre-approved ADU plans that you might have listed on your website and throw them out the window. Because now I got to provide, I got to redesign them just for a new turning radius. Yes, is it possible? Sure. But I just don't think it's reality. I think it's easier just to say, hey, if your main entrance is facing a side yard, then it's got to be 5 feet.
Yeah, if I may, Chair.
Yeah.
No, I agree with you, Ken. And what I'm wondering is I'm hearing there's a design problem that needs to be caught somewhere, whether it's hard coded in or it's just the ability of the fire official or others to say, hey, that's a really bad design. You're not, even internally, you're not allowing for that turn radius, and that needs to be addressed. Whether or not, you have these pre-approved plans or so forth, and then that should be kind of project specific, right? That if you had that pre-approved design, then that clearly would not be allowed within 3 feet of a lot line. Good questions. Okay, thank you.
Okay. Jill.
Yeah, I'm wondering if staff could find whatever's in the Seattle Municipal Code. I wasn't unable to find it in 10 minutes of looking that Ken is referring to, or if you could send that. And then if there's another jurisdiction that is ahead of the Building Code Council, if they could find that language, and just so we have our references to look at. Any other jurisdictions in Washington that are ahead of this. Does that make sense, Dustin?
Yeah, I'm looking. So Ken, you mentioned it was on a tip sheet. Do you happen to know the tip number by chance?
I wish I could do. I'm driving to Tacoma and I just don't have I don't have access to it. I think if you just search ADU setbacks in Seattle, you'll probably come up with some tip sheets and I believe it talks about easements and setbacks and stuff, and I think that might help. But I can come up with just give me some time, and by the time you have your next meeting, which Patrick's going to love to go to, I'll get the information for you.
Yeah, because I think Vancouver was the other one. And we can look that up too.
I can just tell you, regardless of who has it and who doesn't, the problem exists and nobody's addressed it in code language. So all of the setback requirements, nobody has ever really discussed the patient means of egress. It's all been about the rescue windows and laddering the building, but this is the other problem that the fire code is just hasn't been built to address. So we're just trying to find a solution.
Thanks, Ken. Tom, you were next.
Yeah. So first of all, I do want to speak to Jay. Yes, we have a project in Kirkland, and Kirkland is one of the more progressive cities, and we have codes. And these more highly developed cities have been working on ADUs and things. But ADUs, as a mandate by the state, is new for practically most all other cities. And to kind of speak on Ken's point, there isn't every state is kind of doing their own thing, and that's kind of one of the issues and confusion right now. And I don't know that this group is ready to kind of mandate what this might be without a bit more research on what is going on here. But it seems like the primary concern that the problem we're trying to address is being able to turn the gurney. And I will argue with Ken a little bit about throwing out AD plans, because you could maybe notch the entrance, so that you have the radius, the 5 foot clear, but your pathway could still be at 3 feet after you've made the turn. So I think kind of address this problem. It's like, okay, I think there's two components. One is, okay, you're making sure we have 5 feet clear for the entrance, and what is the minimum width that we do need for any kind of pathway.
No, I'm not going to debate that you could notch an entrance. I was just bringing up the point that when you already have previously approved ADU plans that don't have notch entrances, that could become an issue. Yes, I could think you could notch it and then turn to a side yard that's only 3 feet. I agree. And that could happen. It's just, it would have to be designed that way.
All right, thank you. Patrick, you were next, and then Todd.
Yeah, thank you. I want to say I greatly appreciate everything emergency services go through to rescue and help people. And I know that they deal with like really difficult situations. And time willing, I'd be totally willing to do a ride along. But I'm also trying to understand and get enough evidence, since this is like a statewide discussion, for the benefit of not just myself but other people, to understand this problem and why the change is necessary. And when I did quite a bit of research into this over the past few months, and when I was looking into it, it seems like what we're talking about in the IRC is like very long-standing, basically national standards that haven't changed that much. And so I'm trying to understand why those are insufficient and why we need a state amendment to address those. And then, especially when we have instances where local municipalities or jurisdictions or fire code officials already have the ability to address some of these problems in a way that fits their locality. When we introduce a statewide amendment to try to address what we think is a design problem, we now create a restriction that like has to be applied no matter what. And we've already addressed that there may be multiple different ways to address this design problem. And if we put in a very rigid standard, that's going to reduce the flexibility you have to address this. So thank you.
Thank you. And Todd, you were next, and then Darren.
Yeah, and reinforcing something Patrick said, I think that's why we're here, and that's what we established early on, is that this was raised to the council to try to take statewide action on something, and then the council recognized that we don't have planning and zoning represented, outside of, representation by cities and counties. So we wanted to create a forum where we could have this direct conversation and include planning, development code considerations to make sure that we don't use statewide preemption over something that should be a local issue. So I think that's my question to everyone is, where in the process, I know there was concern that this wouldn't get caught in some sort of project specific process. Maybe if we walk through that, we could establish comfort level with everyone that it would get caught, because it's a design consideration, and I'll walk away from this and I'll never design this situation without a recess in an entrance. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Todd. Darren.
And I looked up the Seattle tip sheet 303A, which was adopted or updated December 8th, 2021. And then there's one in a newer one that was updated in July 28th, 2022. So the newer one doesn't have the dimensions on it. The older one does. The older one is 36 by 36. It doesn't have 5 feet on it for residential. Life safety requirements: at least one 3-foot wide swinging egress door shall be provided for each dwelling unit. So it doesn't say 5 feet. Neither one of them say 5 feet. The second one, the newer one, doesn't have a dimension. So I think they're probably working on it, but I don't see a tip sheet that shows 5 feet. So just try to throw it out there. Thanks.
Thank you, Darren. And then Jill, you're next.
Yeah, thanks. I guess as I'm thinking through the problem, it really doesn't matter if the 5-foot radius is at the entrance. What I'm hearing is they want a radius at the turns on the path. And the entrance is not necessarily a turn. The entrance might go straight out into something that goes 10 feet long and then turns to go to the front yard, the street, or the alley. So, 5 feet by 5 feet at the front yard doesn't necessarily get firefighters what they want, and is an imposition as well. It sounds like what you want is a radius at each turn. And so I'm trying to frame the problem differently with that.
Okay, so I think we've had a lot of good discussion here. Whoops, we keep hitting buttons that I shouldn't. Sorry about that. I think, along with consensus of everybody, I think what we should do is, if Ken could get us that code section from their municipal code, we'll get looking at, I know Vancouver has one, and if anybody else, we can take a look at that, and then we can come back with those, and then we can see how those are working, and then have some more discussion on that. Does that sound like a plan to people? I think that's where it sounded like we were going. Tom.
Yes. Okay. So yes, I agree. Let's do a little bit more research, but I think back to Todd's question is that we really got to say, hey, is this something for the State Biblical Council to act on, or is it something that supposedly each jurisdiction should do in their own, development codes, and maybe provide some guidance to that? And I think that's one of the decisions for us to make. Is this a State Biblical Council matter?
Yeah, my thought on that is, that's where what we try to avoid as a code official is any kind of things that aren't clear. And if we allow every jurisdiction to do that, then that comes into an issue whenever somebody goes from one jurisdiction to another. There's no consistency. I think that's what this is about on that. So that's my thoughts on that one. Patrick?
Yes. I just want to point out that I don't know if an emergency amendment is still on the table for this, but I'm assuming that if you end up deciding to do some type of code change, you're going to need to get that included in the 2024 codes. And so you probably want to factor in timeline of when you need to get, if you are going to go that route, when do you need to have that change done and what staff need to do in order to get that included? Because there's been a lot of issues and problems trying to keep that on track for next year. And I think it would be best if you try to minimize anything negatively impacting the 2024 code. So having that timeline in mind of if you want to go a code change route, you're going to need to get it in the 2024 and when dates you have to hit, and sort of what deliverables you need to have done by.
Yeah, good point, Patrick. Thank you. Todd?
Yeah, just want to clarify there, that is off the table at this point. The emergency basis, either through life safety or consistency, was not established. So we are not considering this petition as a council under the basis. What we're trying to head off is say we realize this is a concern and we want to understand it better so that either one, we can inform the legislature because they would take a legislative mandate for us to consider it off cycle, or two, we're at least informing next in 2027 cycle what needs to be addressed. So someone could put in an amendment, a petition in the normal 3-year cycle. If anybody understands it differently, let me know. But that's how I understood the council action.
Well, if we're wrong, Todd, we're wrong together. Because I think that's the way I was.
We're trying
the way
our
I was
best.
looking at it too. So,
Okay.
I think it's an issue, but Patrick does put a good point there. We're coming up, if it was an emergency amendment, which we determined it was not, but it was such a topic that we knew we needed to discuss. And I know that Dustin and staff are under a lot of time constraints too. So, Dustin.
So as part of the code cycle allowances, we are allowed to do an interim update cycle. So we wouldn't potentially necessarily need to put something like this off all the way to 2027 if we decided we wanted to bring it to the 2024 codes. We wouldn't necessarily get the benefit of having this in a print version of the 2024 codes, but anything that we did change would get put on the ICC website, would be updated in our WACs, and we could have some messaging about it as well. But there is some option if we're not looking for immediate effect in the 2024 codes. We have, that's part of the consideration for our scheduling of the 2027 code is also, are we making room for an update cycle as allowed per the statute?
Well, thanks for the clarification, Dustin, because this is my first year on here and I don't know all the intricacies yet. So,
well, and that's fresh legislation from 2024 cycle. So we didn't embark on an interim cycle for the 2021 codes, but it's on the table, and it has to happen in a time frame. So if we implement, let's say November 1 of 26, 12 months after, we can begin a cycle, and we have to complete within 6 months. So we have a 6-month window to do an intervening code cycle for updates, more for clarifications on errors and omissions, but something like this could be brought into that as well, potentially.
okay, Thank you. Ken?
So this is what I brought up at the last Building Code Council meeting, and Dirk gave us his opinion with regards to public comment when the CR 102 comes out. He specifically said that you can make a public comment on anything, even if it's not part of a petition. So anything that's in the WAC, 5150, 5154A, 5151, whatever it is, that you can put in a public comment for a section. And so I think that there's, based on what he said, this could be included through a public comment if somebody wanted to propose something into the code, and then the Building Code Council would have to tackle it. And if I heard that wrong, but that's kind of why I kind of pushed him on it at the Building Code Council meeting.
I would agree that he said you could comment on any component of the codes 100%. I think that it might be ill-advised for the council to make a change that is introduced that way, as it might be considered that substantive change that happens after CR 102. But I still think it's a possibility to introduce a topic during the public comment process, yes.
All right, thanks everyone. I got to jump off. And if
Thank
you
you,
have any
Ken.
other Seattle questions, I see that Sean Shepard's on, and he can answer anything because he's the best.
Way to put him on the spot.
I know.
Yeah. Thank you, though, Ken.
All right, Sean, you've been teed up.
He's been awfully quiet. Don't blame him. So, okay, I think we're at a point here that I think we have a plan forward. And I think it's a good topic. Obviously, it's a very important topic, and that's why we're going this route. So, and to Patrick's point, with a lot of meetings and stuff, but I think sometimes that's how you get good code, is by having these meetings and having good discussion and trying to find the errors in our ways and how to fix them, and then making sure we put proper code in. So, Dustin, since you have probably the worst schedule of all of us, with all the meetings you go to, when would be a good time to come back and give us time to do this, to do some research?
So, I mean, I guess as we're talking about this and hearing that we're not pursuing immediate rulemaking, the urgency isn't necessarily there to have a weekly meeting or every other week meeting. I might propose a once a month cadence, for a 2-hour get together, and looking forward, maybe the week of November 17th through the 21st might be an attractive week to have a meeting of this group. And then maybe the third week of each month we could keep that kind of cadence until we make a recommendation for the council.
Okay. Yeah, that works for me. I just know, well, like you said, that'd be the week before Thanksgiving, it looks like. So
Yes.
thank you for not choosing the week of Thanksgiving.
Well, I won't be here. I've already got the time scheduled off, so I'm doing my best to not schedule meetings during times I'm trying to not be in office.
No, I get that, and we all have families and everything else. So, Todd, you had your hand up.
I was just going to put out there that I do think we can probably wrap this up pretty quickly. So maybe try for one more meeting and see if we get to a kind of consensus on what we want to document, and then return it to the council. And because I think that would then align with what I expressed, not concerned, but just anticipation. If something were to come up in Olympia for the session, we've documented as a council kind of some public work on this.
Okay. All right. Well, I think that's a good idea then. The 21st, same time, or is
that works for me. I mean, I don't have a legislative committee meeting already scheduled there, so I shouldn't need to pivot the time a little bit after advertising 2:30. But I maybe prefer, since it's Fridays and people usually, don't want to have business all the way to the end of the day, maybe offer 1 o'clock instead of 3 o'clock.
Yeah, I'm fine with that. I like that idea too, because I'm sure that's why Ken was on the road. So I want to be cognizant of people and their weekends too. So we will plan on then the Friday, November 21st at 1 o'clock right now. And then gives us some time to do a little more research.
And as far as this, we're looking for the Seattle, tip sheet, maybe municipal code excerpts there. And is there any other considerations? I will try to get some other jurisdictions who might have these setbacks already established. I heard Vancouver as one, potentially Tacoma as one, and we'll try to reach out and maybe I can get together with WABO and see if they can just put a notice out to jurisdictions that if you have this existing side yard setback requirement established, maybe invite them to our meeting next time.
Okay, that sounds good. And then I think I don't have the agenda in front of us, but I think that's pretty much it on the agenda, isn't it?
Yeah, I think we have other business on there as well, but
That's just a standard.
yeah.
All right. So that being said, unless anybody has any desire to keep going for another hour or two, I really don't. We'll adjourn the meeting, and like I said, we will reconvene on Friday the 21st at 1 o'clock.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everybody. Appreciate the time.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.